Criminology discussion group at the University of Oxford, and we're very happy to have this our first hybrid session today with Dr. Mark Brown, who has come to talk to us about the possibility of an ethics of practice in Southernizing criminology. This talk is set in the context of our topic for this term, which is offering methodological, theoretical, and philosophical tools for our work. And as this is a dual seminar, I will be taking the questions from the people here, and Luis will take care of those of you who are online. To hear a bit more about the logistics of that and to introduce our speaker for today, I'll leave you with Luis.
Thanks, Carla.
Sorry, let me see. Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
All right. Okay. So hi, everyone. Just echoing Carla, we're so delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Brown today. Mark, many thanks for coming. I'm gutted I'm not able to make in person. As I told you, I've got this personal issue. So I got 2 fractured toes and I can't walk. So, I mean, that's just fine. That's life. So Dr. Mark Brown's presentation is titled More Than an Intellectual Project Towards an Ethics of Practice in Southern Criminology. So he'll speak for about half an hour, and then we're going to have some time for the discussion. And as usual, I'd ask you to keep muted during his talk, and then during the Q&A, you can all use the Teams to raise your hand, then ask a question, or if you prefer, just type your question in the chat. As you can see, we're recording Mark's presentation, but we're not gonna record the Q&A, and this will be then made available on our page on YouTube. Right, so Mark Brown teaches in the School of Law at the University of Sheffield. He's also an honorary senior fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. His work spans topics in punishment and penal theory, criminal justice, law, and with a particular emphasis on historical and comparative studies. He has spent 20 years researching crime and law and justice in South Asia, publishing, among other things, Penal Power and Colonial Rule, book published in 2014. Also published another study of its post-colonial continuities in an article, Post-Colonial Penality, Liberty and Repression in the Shadow of Independency, India, 1947. That was published in Theoretical Criminology. But yeah, so Mark, welcome again. Thanks for joining us. And once more, apologies for not being able to make it in person. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Luis. Thank you very much, and it's good to see everyone here today. And I'm, amongst my other duties, the director of the Centre for Criminology at University of Sheffield, and we too are trying this hybrid seminar format. And I think we've just done one, and it's been quite productive, and we've actually managed to get a good balance going. So we're a guinea pig exercise today, but I hope that what I have to say will be of interest to you as Southern criminologists or people with interest in Southern criminology, but it'll also try and balance, and this reflects very much my own interests, some thinking work with the idea of doing things as well. And so while it is a philosophical discussion at some points, it's very much grounded in the idea that we will go out into the field and we will do things. Okay, so what am I trying to do in this paper? I should add that the paper itself has been published in Critical Criminology and a special issue on Southern Criminology, and it's free. And the title of it is on the slides, and we can probably link it, can't we, Carla, on the web page. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move past what I think is probably the early stages of Southern criminology, where Southern criminology is understood as a project, which is to say that it has aspirations and ideals and objectives, and those are often rather grand. So it is to decolonise, it is to create epistemic justice and all sorts of things like this. But what does this actually mean? What do we actually need to do? And so I suppose this is the next stage on that I'm trying to address. And so this paper is highly speculative. I completely recognise that, and many people may disagree with it, but I think that's really its purpose, is to take some first steps in trying to say, well, it's not what we intend to do, it's actually how are we going to achieve this. So what I'm proposing is that in order to go into the field as researchers, we need to adopt an ethical stance. And I'm just going to suggest in this paper that Kantian philosophy offers a good starting point. But I'm also going to, in a way, try and evidence or demonstrate that which I'm advocating by actually creating a dialogue between South Asian scholars and the European tradition, of whom Kant is one important person, and much more recently there's Hans-Georg Gadamer, who has this text, Truth and Method, from 1960, that has been important not only in European theory but also in South Asia as well. And so it's really in the convergence of two thought traditions, a European thought tradition and a South Asian thought tradition, that we begin to get some guidance on how we can actually do research in the field and engage across boundaries. So I'll just click this. There it is. Right. So that is essentially then a question of turning intentions into practices. And what are some of these intentions? Well, this paper stems from a short paragraph in a book on writing. And in that paragraph, I made a couple of points, and then I've actually come back to explore those in more detail, and they've produced this paper. But it was based around Dipesh Chakrabarty's ideas in his book Provincialising Europe, that the way forward is to create a kind of a post-colonial methodology which allows us to produce these things he terms plural normative horizons. That is a bringing together of disparate thought traditions. So that's one point of departure. Another is Raewyn Connells, and Raewyn's spoken to this group last week?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. And Raewyn talks about this, that we cannot keep heaping new ideas on new ideas on new ideas, because they're just kind of stacking up in a big pile, and what we need is some integration. And so she talks about knowledge on a global scale being based on a principle of unification of ideas and ways of thinking. And David Goyers, who's a friend and who commissioned this special issue commissioned me to write this paper for the special issue of Critical Criminology, and who's a green criminologist, has argued that, going to the south, we need to think about our conduct far more in terms of the structural relationships between north and south, and that ethical thinking has to be guided by structural considerations. And so we therefore need what he terms as deep respect for ethical considerations. So these are some of the points of departure. I wanted to ground this in some kind of practical examples. And I had, when I spoke at a conference in Bogota in, I think, November 2019, and there I used two examples. One of them was what I'm going to talk about today. The other was from some work I did in Ghana on witchcraft in northern Ghana, and far north of Ghana, just below Burkina Faso, out on the sort of like the great kind of sub-Saharan Sahelian plain there. And
Sorry, I think you've got muted now.
Is that okay now?
Yeah, now it's working. Thank you. Fantastic. Sorry.
Right. Okay. So what I do in the paper is I try and work through produce a kind of a worked example of how this works, not in something which is rather unusual, like witchcraft, which I was looking at in northern Ghana, but in fact something very, very ordinary, which is penal reform, which you find all around the place. And I happen to have been working in South Asia, in and around this topic for about 20 years, and South Asia is the place that I know best. And so I use a South Asian case study of penal reform, but I think the general principles are relevant right throughout the South. I use in the paper an article written by Deborah Drake, which I think is it's an excellent distillation of progressive criminology's attitude to the prison and to the problems of penal reform in the South. And Deborah Drake talks about the fiasco of the prison and the need for us all to address the truth about prisons. Because if we don't address the truth about prisons, we're simply going to reproduce eternally the problems of the prison. And that is a kind of, I think, mainstream attitude within progressive criminology, and so it would seem to be difficult to argue with, and so I've decided to argue with. And that's what I want to do, and that's what I do through this paper. So the conclusions that I reach...
Well, there already. Sorry.
Sorry. The conclusions that I reach are that we need to develop a personal ethics of practice, and I'll talk about this in a few moments, that we can achieve this through staging a kind of an encounter between North and South, between different thought traditions, and that we're actually it's going to result in something quite specific and I hope quite useful, which is an ethical norm, which is a norm of engagement, which will talk about how we need to engage as I am, as a northern criminologist, or you could equally say as a northern trained criminologist or social scientist, and an epistemology, which is to say a description of a set of procedures or a explanation of how knowledge can emerge. And in this case, it's through dialogue. So, right, there's not a lot of time, so I just want to, rather than trying to replicate the paper itself, I want to talk to 10 points in it, and I'll spend more or less time on these. So I think the first point is that when we're talking about ethics, we need to distinguish between institutional ethics, such as are reflected in those ethics application forms we all need to fill in at university, either as students or as researchers, which ask us to identify any ethical problems, such as whether we're working with high-risk populations, whether there are relationships of dependency, how we're going to recruit, whether that recruitment is affected by dependency, whether we gain consent, whether that's affected by capacity, and all of these sorts of things. So, as Jerry Johnson has pointed out, while these are at one level about ethics, they are also very much about institutional risk management, and that institutional and risk management, reputational risk and litigation risk become blurred with what ought to be ethical considerations. And so the point is simply to say that I'm not talking about this type of ethics or this level of thinking about ethics. Well, I want to go somewhat deeper in this. Right. So my starting point, therefore, is to work with the Kant's categorical imperative, which we all implicitly know something about. What people tend to recognise less is that it actually has a few versions, and it's in its second formulation that we're probably most familiar. So there is not the categorical imperative. There are ways in which this idea is worked through in different forms. But you can see here that so what it's essentially distinguishing is between treating others as instruments versus treating others as valuable moral beings, as moral actors in their own right. And so the phrase is to act in such a way that you treat humanity, other people, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always and at the same time as an end. And this is something which has been problematic for criminology. It's well recognised in critiques, for example, of offender risk prediction, that when we gather data on this offender, that when we assess an offender, that when we talk to the offender, when we elicit information from the offender, we're not doing that in the offender's best interests. We are doing that in our own best interests because we want to reduce the risks that person could pose to the wider population. And so the offender is being used simply as an instrument in achieving our ends, which is public safety. There are good examples in Southern criminology contexts from this, and David Goyes talks a lot about this in green criminology, where he works in Colombia and through Central America, where he talks about the generation of data from Indigenous people. And I know, in Australia and New Zealand, this is also a large issue where researchers generate, quote unquote, data from Indigenous populations. That becomes a form of capital. They write important articles. They make promotion applications. They, receive, prestigious invitations. All of this on the back of capital, which has been extracted from these individuals or populations. So Gadamer is someone who I discovered through someone else I'm going to speak about in a few moments, who's Gopal Guru, who is an Indian scholar, and I'll talk about him, so I won't preface him at the moment, but what I will say is that the interesting thing about this is actually came to Gadamer through Guru's work. And so what he is asking, what Gadamer is asking, he's taken Kant and he says, okay, so how can we reach, so how, as in by what means, by what method, can we reach understanding, which is a form of shared, accepted knowledge, which he terms truth, across boundaries that are incommensurable. And his approach is looking back through time. So what makes the boundaries incommensurable for him is he is thinking, how do we engage with the past when those in the past have left us? So how do we treat people in the past in an ethically acceptable fashion? For me, I'm thinking of the boundaries as boundaries of power, of knowledge, but also of location, north-south, history, of imperialism, of subjection, of culture, of religion, various forms of experience, and so on. And so what Gadamer's answer is that we need to engage across these boundaries in a way that treats the other as fully human. Now we can see that it's very easy not to do that from the example of the prediction example, or from harvesting data from Indigenous communities. So how might we go about this in another way? What Gadamer does, this slide is a little dense, and I do apologise for that, but the points are important ones just here. So what Gadamer argues is that any time we engage with another, we are being offered the opportunity to establish a moral connection with that other. And he terms this the I-thou relationship. So he says a thou is not an object. Okay, so we can calculate the risks that autonomous driving cars can create for the population, of how many citizens that's going to hurt. But that object, gathering data from that object is entirely different from gathering data from an offender, because an offender is not an object. An offender relates himself or herself to us, and so and draws us into an ethical space. And so the question is, how do we construct that space, and how can we be guided by the demands of conduct in that space? So one of the ways that Gadamer suggests that we know we would be doing this, how can we determine, there's a lovely fading of the light in the screen. How would we know whether or not we were treating another as a fully autonomous moral actor? And the answer is, he suggests, that we would know that if we were fully open to the idea that another person holds a truth that we cannot know or do not know. I mean, you guys in this room all know the quickest way to the Tesco from here. I'm not talking about the fact that you know things and I don't know them like that, because I can work that out myself. We're talking about a form of knowledge which exists through a knowledge system which lays beyond my horizon. In this context of talking between north and south. And to give you an example of where this produces a problem for criminology is going back to this example of penal reform. Criminology's criticisms of the prison and its advocation against the export of the prison to the south is based on, and I'm using this article by Deborah Drake as an example, is based on a claim that we have understood the truth about prisons. And this is the phrase that Drake uses, that there is a truth about prisons, and penal reform ought to be grounded in a honest speaking of the truth to reveal the fiasco of the prison, which is her phrase. And in this is the way I argue that the sense that we know this creates a relationship whereby we school or teach those in these situations where the prison might be exported. So southern people, southern organisations, southern governments, we school or teach them on a truth that we know to exist. And this is the first step, I'm suggesting, in breaching this ethical space that Gadamer suggests we should work within. And so here is his key insight. I want to touch on this and then move very quickly into the South Asian context, because I know I'm using time. So what Gadamer is arguing is that progressive, well-meaning judgment about what is right and what is wrong, or what is good for another, or what is bad, or what they should take on, or what they should reject, or what they should replicate, or what they shouldn't, actually constitutes what he terms a reflective form of domination. Because in his example, he argues this is a well exampled in charity or welfare work. And so he says, by understanding the other, okay, so understanding what the needs of a southern society might be in the penal sphere, by claiming, and this is his language, by claiming to know him, one robs their claims of their legitimacy. Okay, so there's nothing original you can say to me, because I actually know what your problem is. I know what your needs are. And in fact, essentially, I can anticipate what your experience is going to be. So the dialectic, in particular, the dialectic of charitable or welfare work operates in this way, penetrating all relationships between men, in this language, as a reflective form of the effort to dominate. The claim to understand another person in advance, essentially in advance of themselves. They ask for reform, but they do not yet know what they're going to get if they get more prison. Functions to keep the other person's claim at a distance. So, and we're familiar with this from the teacher-pupil relationship, an authoritative form of welfare work. So what Gadamer is essentially arguing is, and I think this is, and I'll put it in a sort of a southern north-south context, is more acute for southern criminologists and in the context of southern criminology, because criminology as a discipline essentially accepts what Dipesh Chakrabarty terms global historical time, which is the idea that societies move through a linear form of time, that form has been preceded through first by European societies and the North and so on, which is why, of course, we talk about development in the South as the South follows through. So in all discussions of reform, whether it be the UN talking about aid for cities, or whether we be talking about penal reform, there is a presumption that societies are going to move along the same path. Okay, so let me flick through to South Asia. So Gopal Guru and Sundar Surikai, let me change that slide, produced a book, 2012, called The Cracked Mirror, an Indian Debate on Experience and Theory, which is a series of debates as they work through and debate a series of issues about the status and the position of India's Dalit population. For those of you not familiar with Dalits, Dalits are those who within the caste Hindu structure were what was termed untouchables. And today there are more than 200 million Dalits in India. And so the question that Guru asks to kick off this conversation is, who can say what is good for Dalits? Who knows what is best for a Dalit, for the Dalit community, for Dalit progress, for Dalit emancipation, for Dalit engagement? Who can say this? Because in the history of independent India, a kind of progressive welfarist movement has attempted to reclaim these groups. In the constitution you have scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward castes as well. Okay, so there is this idea of backwardness and bringing forward, and it very much replicates this vision of people who are ahead and people who are behind that Chakrabarti talks about. And Guru argues strongly that only Dalits should research and speak about Dalits. He argues Dalits must become the subject of their own thinking rather than becoming the object of someone else's thinking. So here we are talking about a thought tradition which is independent of Gadamer's tradition, but which is convergent with it. And so what he's essentially arguing, what Guru is arguing after Gadamer, I think, is that the offer to another of epistemological empowerment, to use Guru's words, or epistemological charity, to help someone because you know almost better than they do what it is in fact they really need, is a form of domination. It creates a patron-client relationship. And in Guru's words, it poisons the soul of the Dalit, because the Dalit cannot be independent while someone else speaks for him or her. So this is one convergent tradition, and I want to just hold it there for a moment. The other is by three writers, Prathama Banerjee, Aditya Nigam and Rakesh Pandey, who have an article. It's a short article, but I think it's an excellent article called The Work of Theory. And many of the ideas which Gadamer develops, you can see flowing also through, or the convergence between them in their work. And so one point they make, and it might be difficult for people in the room to see that bottom line, is that critique of the histories of colonialism or imperialism or anything like this can only bring us so far, and that critique cannot produce autonomous theory in its own right. And one of the difficulties they argue with thinking in the South is not simply thinking using concepts that come from a thought tradition that are not your own, but also thinking with concepts where there is a masking of the specificity of the knowledge on which theory was developed. And that masking generates a claim to a universalism which allows particularistic empirical facts to appear as if they were general or universal theory. And so they argue aspects of European history continue to function as philosophical, theoretical archetypes rather than as what they are, which is empirical history. And they use examples of the French Revolution and the enclosure of the commons. And they use a phrase which I find very apposite. What they argue is that together with this idea of time flowing in a linear fashion, of us being ahead of them, this masking of empirical history, of theory that is essentially empirical history, then presents theories or understandings of the way that the world works. It creates at once a theoretical norm and an historical necessity. And as soon as you begin thinking about the concept of the prison, you can see how this works. So there is a presumption that prisons will always work in the same way everywhere. There is a presumption that the experience of the North with their failure to find a way of using confinement effectively or productively creates actually an historical necessity that it will be the same always elsewhere. And so what Banerjee and so on are arguing is that, in fact, theory only emerges when ideas are liberated and experiences are liberated from their origins. And so what masquerades as theory or understanding, or to use Deborah Drake's terms, the truth about prisons and the fiasco of the prison, is not necessarily a universal experience. In fact, it's not even universal theory. Actually, what it is, it's a story about northern prisons. But this is retailed as if it were something universal, something that everyone must experience and everyone will experience. And so what they suggest is that we need to create a platform for a kind of syncretic dialogue, a bringing together of different thought traditions, different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world. And she uses and they use the example of B.R. Ambedkar. Some of you will know as a great Dalit reformer, an architect of the Indian Constitution, a Buddhist who sought to find a future for the Dalits. And what they say is this is sort of this will sort of come together in a moment. So Ambedkar sought to arrive at a future for Dalits, a future that the present could not engender out of its own logic. So if we just follow one thread, there is no way we could get to where he wanted to be for Dalits simply by working within the established paradigms of constitutional and social welfare uplift. And so what he argues is that Ambedkar stages a complex encounter between the modern and non-modern, between tradition and counter-tradition in his thought, as a way of imagining a future that cannot be imagined otherwise. And so in my own work in South Asia, in penal reform, where I'm working in a Buddhist society at the moment, beginning with I'm beginning to work through some of these ideas, and what both Gautama argues and what Banerjee and her colleagues are arguing is that we need a form of dialogue which begins with a question. So rather than telling a truth, can we tell? Can we begin with a question? And I'll walk you through this momentarily. I just want to return us back to Gautama. And so the ethics of this, the ethics of practice, is found in a methodology that respects human dignity through a form of ethical engagement. And Gautama suggests, and I think it's implicit in Banerjee and colleagues, that a dialogue grounded in questioning rather than truth-telling is the way to get there. Because, and so what Gautama says, the significance of questioning in dialogue, and so dialogue here is not being used as a shorthand for something else. It's not being used as a kind of a metaphor or anything. It is actually a methodology. So what place can we get to if we think about the problem through a process of asking questions about it rather than telling what we know about it? Rather than saying, well, this is the truth about prisons in the north, what's your truth in the south, or this is what you should know, can we open up the problem through a question? So the significance of questioning dialogue consists in revealing the questionability of that which is questioned. And in my work in South Asia, in a Buddhist society where confinement and sequestration, that is the taking of a person away and out of society for a period of time, have a completely different valence because they are tied up with monastic practices, with deeply religious practices, with cultural traditions. What does that offer to us as we begin to think through penal reform? What must a form of confinement, for example, do? Is the removal of the person the key feature of a confinement that is a punishment? Is creating some pain the key feature of a confinement that is a punishment? Now, when we talk about the prison, we immediately think about an institutional architecture. But if we begin to ask the question of others in your life and your experience and your world, what does confinement represent? Does it punish? Can confinement be productive? is the removal of an individual and their atonement in some way able to produce the circumstances for their reintegration into society. We're actually talking about the same things as what you might broadly term imprisonment, but we're beginning to arrive at something which might look quite different. And so what we learn in this Buddhist society is that there is a notion of tadanchi, which translates as something like dignity, which is not equivalent to human rights. So while we talk about the importance of the human rights compliant prison, and while we talk about the difficulty that prisons in the South present for people's rights, in fact, in this society, a guiding principle is not rights, it's dignity. And what are the constituent features of this dignity which might allow a confinement that is punitive because it responds to an act of transgression, but that is productive, that engages with keys, draws on things that make sense within a cultural tradition that is not our own. And what I've been saying here in the last 3, 4, 5 minutes has simply been a set of questions, hasn't it? It hasn't been a process of telling, it hasn't been a process of describing. It's actually been a set of questions about how others might experience things and what their priorities might be. And all of these things are about lives lived across boundaries that are beyond my horizon. And so what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to work through this this exercise in creating an ethics and a methodology through my own work in this Buddhist South Asian society. And what we can see here is that whereas previously at the very start of this, the idea of incommensurability of two people whose experiences cannot be mapped across each other, or two societies that are entirely different, might have been thought of as a problem, here it becomes the engine. Because in a methodology grounded in the question, in the opening out of a problem, we actually rely on the fact that the other has a truth and an experience that we don't have access to develop our own thinking. And so when the other asks us about something or answers one of our questions, our own horizons begin to expand in ways that couldn't be imagined, and to use that phrase, that couldn't have been engendered out of their own logic. But my own logic, my existing logic, the logic I brought to that encounter. And so what I'm suggesting, speculatively at least, is that here we may have a solution to the problem of how to engage in a way which promotes human dignity. And so that's really my last point. So the suggestion, therefore, is that we find here a norm of ethical engagement, that we cannot be any longer harvesting data and so on from individuals or communities and so on. We actually need to find a way of engaging ethically which treats others as fully human. And the question of, well, how specifically do you do that, I'm suggesting is something which can be achieved through this this epistemology of dialogue, a way of opening out the problem through a series of questions rather than converging the problem, condensing and reducing the problem through a process of telling. And that I hope in my own work in the South is going to allow us, my colleagues and I, to develop penal reform suggestions which make sense in that society, which is a society which both has prisons, recognises that they are a feature of modernity, but is also dissatisfied with them. And so penal alternatives in this society are not community-based sentences. They are something entirely different, and they may well involve confinement, the removal of offenders, but we are trying to find a way of thinking into ways in which this could be a constructive exercise rather than an instructional exercise. Okay, that's me.
Shall we please real life applause?
The first Southernizing session where we actually